Mr. President, members of the High Table, distinguished guests. We have been talking about the MCC for quite some time now, according to my friend, President's Counsel Gunawansa. It's since 2018 that we have been doing this. We discussed this extensively in the lead up to the presidential election. In fact, we had a venerable monk even threatening to fast unto death. Fortunately, that didn't happen. And the election was held. We made certain commitments. But the MCC hangs around like a bad smell, a really bad smell. We've discussed other agreements as well. We discussed the free trade agreement with Singapore. That was challenged by the professionals, but it is still in our books. It's a done deal. Along with the MCC, or prior to the MCC and the free trade agreement with Singapore, we talked about the CEPA, the agreement with India. Fortunately, that did not go to fruition, again, because of the opposition expressed by the professionals of this country. We all know what happened. I spoke about it as well on more than one occasion, but it was never concluded. I think one of the leading lights in the opposition to the CEPA was the GMOA, and I can see the president sitting at the back there. But I don't think in a democracy like ours, we need to struggle with our legislatures in this fashion. There are two other agreements which I would like to touch upon, the AXA and the SOFA, both with the Americans. And the AXA is a done deal. It's been signed, concluded, and it's now a binding commitment on the part of Sri Lanka as well as the United States. The SOFA, we don't know. Only a few weeks ago, the cabinet spokesman blandly announced that it has been concluded. Up to date, it has not been formally denied or the statement retracted. So what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to think? The important thing is that the government seems to be doing these things either deliberately or through negligence and feeding the population with this type of snippets of information which creates doubts, which creates the background for an acceptance eventually. I hope that this is not the strategy, but other countries have indulged in strategies of this nature. And then, of course, we have to remember that the GMOA also went to the High Court to obtain an injunction against all three of these agreements, the AXA, the SOFA, and the MCC. Nevertheless, the government of the day, that's the government which was voted out of office, or the president who was voted out of office recently, his government actually signed the AXA, despite there being an action pending before the High Court. And the reason for challenging those agreements which the government was planning to conclude was because of a fundamental tenet of sovereignty incorporated in the constitution of this country. And then, of course, with regard to the MCC, we know that a committee was appointed, the Gunaruwan Committee, to go into the pros and cons of this proposed agreement. The Gunaruwan Committee has recommended against concluding this agreement. But up to date, we don't know where we are on it. Is the government proposing to agree to this, or is the government going to shelve it? We also heard recently that the government will appoint another subcommittee to go into this, a cabinet subcommittee. And then the people who were supposed to go on this cabinet subcommittee, as opposed to those who were in the Gunurwan committee, who were academics and highly acclaimed persons in our society, are individuals who probably don't even have their O-levels. So what is going on? Are we being subjected to a game here where we are being tossed around? Our concerns are being played around with? I hope that at least after the election, the government will take a firm stance and deal with the electorate with a lot more transparency than it has been doing so far. And this is very important because a lot of confidence was placed in what we did in November last year when we elected the new president, and I believe the same confidence will be placed in the electors after the general election in another 2 weeks' time, or 10 days' time. I hope that the confidence that the electorate has placed in our leaders, our representatives, will not be misplaced, will not be abused. Now, what is the MCC? The Millennium Challenge Corporation. It is a bilateral U.S. foreign aid agency established by the U.S. Congress in 2004. It is said to be an independent agency, separate from the State Department and the age-old USAID. That is what it is supposed to be. But this statement has been challenged by many. The MCC Board of Directors, please note, is comprised of the Secretary of State as the chair, the Secretary of the Treasury, the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, the Administrator of USAID, the CEO of the MCC Corporation itself, and 4 private sector members appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. The current Chief Executive Officer of the MCC, Sean Cairncross, was nominated by President Trump and sworn in on the 24th of June 2019, and he was a former senior advisor to the President. Against that background, are we to take the comment that it is an independent agency too seriously? Because all the top managers of this corporation, the MCC, are representatives of the American administration, or they are directly appointed by the President. Just as an aside, we have been told consistently not to deal with Chinese corporations because of state interference in their management and their structures. What is the difference between the MCC and any Chinese corporation which is supposed to be managed by the Chinese government? I just leave that with you. You can come to your own conclusions. Although the MCC's primary commitment is said to be poverty reduction, many have argued that it is all about, and I'm quoting, reshaping the legal, institutional, infrastructural, and financial context of poorer countries to better suit U.S. economic and commercial interests. It is very important to remember those comments, and these are by academics who write independently, not in order to push a particular viewpoint, but because they have been confronted with the phenomenon of the MCC, its structure, and its funding. You have to remember that the MCC is totally funded by the US government also. It has also been said that the MCC is an instrument of the new imperialism pursuing economic hegemony through the extension of and ever-deepening penetration of neoliberal capitalism. As we have heard, the MCC will be funding 2 main projects in Sri Lanka. The transport project focuses on improving traffic management improving the road network along the central ring road for better connectivity between the western province and peripheral provinces, and the modernization of the public bus system. On face value, we cannot find any problems with that goal, with that objective. But as President's Council Gunavansa pointed out, you need to read the fine print and see what actually it is going to achieve and how it is going to achieve this. And then, of course, secondly, there is the land project, which has caused considerable disconcert in this country, focuses on creating a parcel fabric map and inventory of state lands, digitizing the deeds registry, facilitating the ongoing work to move Sri Lanka from a deed registration system to a title registration system, digitizing key valuation information for properties in targeted districts, and establishing land policy councils to support the government's work on land policy and legislation. And I believe that this aspect will be handled more extensively by one of the other speakers. There is also an element of the land aspect of the MCC which we need to be particularly conscious about. That is the possibility of a corridor being created between Trincomalee and Colombo for God knows for whose benefit. Because I can't see personally, and I have lived in this country for quite some time, I've traveled around this country. If you're talking about poverty alleviation, the districts that should be addressed are not necessarily the districts between Trincomalee and Colombo. There are other districts. In the Vani, in Uva, in the southern province, which are more affected by poverty and deprivation than the districts that have been identified from Trincomalee to Colombo. So it may not be poverty that is essentially behind this goal that has been talked about. So we need to be more conscious or be aware of what is really going on behind the scenes here. Sri Lanka's project proposals for the compact were submitted to the MCC board in November 2017, and the Sri Lanka compact was approved by the MCC board in April 2019, just a few days after the disastrous Easter Sunday bombings. Again, you will recall the then minister making the comment that at least one good thing has happened as a result of the bombings. 300 people died, many more were injured, some for life, incapacitated for life, and then he says, oh, something good has happened from all that. Leave it at that. Curiously, the MCC was negotiated in secret by a team selected by the former Prime Minister, and it was negotiated with the corporation. News about it seeped out after a piece was published in the Sunday Times by the journalist Iqbal Athas. In response to persistent public demands for transparency, a draft of the MCC was at last published on the website of the Sri Lankan Ministry of Finance last November, on the 5th of November, just 11 days before a hotly contested presidential election. Now, a number of questions arise here. Why was the public or Parliament not taken into confidence in the negotiation of an agreement of this nature? It is an agreement that will have extensive implications for the utilization of land, for land policy, and for land used by the average individual. But neither the Parliament nor the public were taken into confidence whilst this was being negotiated. As again Myra said, those who negotiated this, some of whom have already left the country, may not have been fully aware or may not have taken the trouble to become fully aware of the consequences of this agreement. You might very well argue that this is not the only agreement of this nature that the MCC has negotiated with the rest of the world. Dr. Padania mentioned 47. I think the number is a little more than that. And 7 have been completed. But what we know is that none of these agreements resulted in the delivery of the full amount that was committed at the beginning. Because funds necessary for the implementation of any MCC agreement has to be approved by the US Congress every year. And we are supposedly getting $480 million over a period of 5 years. The question arises as to whether we will end up getting $480 million or we will, like most of the other recipients of MCC grants and loans, will end up receiving much less than what is committed. So this is an issue that is not resolved in the agreement itself, and there are provisions in the agreement which have an impact on this question. Now, the MCC itself is intended to be an agreement of treaty status. It is between two entities capable of entering into treaties internationally. The MCC, which is a US government corporation acting on behalf of the US government, and Sri Lanka, acting through the Ministry of Finance and Mass Media. Curiously, it is the Ministry of Finance and Mass Media which will be representing Sri Lanka. Technically, there is no problem with that, but it is interesting that it is not the Foreign Ministry or any other senior ministry but the Ministry of Finance that has been allocated the responsibility of representing Sri Lanka in the case of the MCC. The agreement is intended to be to create legally binding rights and obligations. The draft itself says that it is governed by international law. This may suggest that the compact and all its activities will be above the Sri Lankan law, and Sri Lankan citizens may not be able to seek legal assistance from their own judicial system in the event of any loss or damage caused by the MCC. Myra has dealt with this extensively, so I won't go any further into it. Moreover, Sri Lanka, for its part, could be taken to an international court or tribunal if it breaches the provisions of the compact or backs out of the compact or contravenes any of its clauses. Sri Lanka, unlike the USA, has only limited experience in international adjudication and is likely to be confronted by serious constraints in such a situation. As an illustration, the US has taken China before the WTO dispute settlement body 20 times and won on every single occasion. It has been said that trade wars are not good or easy to win, but the United States does generally win trade disputes, especially against China. In cases it brings in the World Trade Organization, contrary to President Trump's assertion that we lose the lawsuits, almost all the lawsuits, US officials have won 20 times in their challenges to Chinese trade practices since the first US WTO case against China in 2004. None was lost, and 3 cases are still pending. The Chinese officials have brought 16 complaints against the United States since 2002 and won just 5 lost one, and got a split decision in 3, with 7 pending. The point I'm trying to make is simply this. The US has extensive experience in conducting international dispute settlement proceedings. We have very little, and even the couple of times that we have gone before international tribunals, I don't think we fared too well. And in a situation like that, to expose ourselves to the heavy guns that the US can blast us with, I think is absolutely irresponsible on the part of those who negotiated this agreement. It is also important to note that the MCC provisions have been very carefully drafted, and of course there are precedents to go by. It includes a sunset clause. Basically means that it ends after 5 years. There is a provision which says that it will last for 5 years. Either party may terminate this compact without cause in its entirety or by giving the other party 30 days prior notice. The MCC, that's a corporation, may also terminate this compact or the MCC funding without cause, in part or by giving the government 30 days prior notice. While little Sri Lanka could theoretically terminate the compact under this provision, the practicalities of doing so and incurring the displeasure of the US superpower needs to be kept in mind by our policymakers. I wonder whether this was done when we negotiated this compact. On the other hand, the US and the MCC could and have in other instances terminated MCC compacts without cause and for reasons not connected with the stated goals of poverty alleviation or development. For example, take the case of Madagascar, where the compact was terminated after 3 years for political reasons. The above provision would enable the MCC to terminate the compact or the funding for reasons that would be purely political. That is where the risk for Sri Lanka lies. The US and the MCC could just walk away, even for reasons that have nothing to do with the goals of the compact, perfectly in accordance with the provisions of the compact itself, without incurring any liability. Political factors are never far from even the most simple economic decision-making processes of a major power. In 2007, the US withdrew the MCC offer made to Sri Lanka after the tsunami for exactly such political reasons. You have to remember, and many people don't seem to realize it, that the MCC offer was made to Sri Lanka in 2004 initially. It was not finalized, but the offer was on the table. The compact was on the table. So, and then I will read from a diplomatic cable sent by Ambassador Robert Blake in January 2008. Of course, there is nothing confidential about this anymore. It was reproduced in WikiLeaks. And this was 12 days after the Sri Lankan government decided to abrogate the ceasefire agreement. And the cable says, in December 2007, the board of the Millennium Challenge Corporation removed Sri Lanka as a country eligible for MCC funding for 2008. The cancellation of Sri Lanka's eligibility status was one among a number of measures, please note, one among a number of measures taken by the US to signal its displeasure at the escalating violence and growing human rights problems in Sri Lanka. The determination that there was human rights problems in Sri Lanka was made by the US in accordance with its own criteria, with no impact or no input from the affected country, Sri Lanka. The MCC draft as it stands at present would enable the US to adopt similar measures without incurring any liability for resulting loss or damage. Given the implications of the MCC as it is drafted for the lives of hundreds of thousands of individuals, the ability to walk away without incurring any liability raises serious legal and other issues. Very importantly, and this has been touched upon already, the MCC explicitly provides immunity to the government of the USA, the MCC, its employees and contractors for a range of actions and omissions. Again, if I could repeat myself, should the US government or the MCC decide to pull back the funding, walk away from their commitments at any stage of the 5-year compact period, for whatever reason, they would assume no liability for any claims or losses. Furthermore, it is not only the US government and the MCC and the MCC that would enjoy immunity from the jurisdiction of our courts and tribunals for loss or claims arising out of the activities under the compact, but also the current and former officers and employees of the US and the MCC. We know that all these provisions protect only the US side. The fact that the MCC is a treaty does not leave room for any degree of complacency. A treaty, of course, is different from a contract. A treaty is governed by international law, and recourse in the case of a dispute with regard to a treaty is international courts and tribunals, while a contract is governed by domestic law and is enforced in the domestic courts. The international law on treaties has mostly been codified by the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties 1969, which codifies the rules and procedures for creating, enforcing, amending, and interpreting treaties. As one of the earliest manifestations of international relations, treaties are recognized as a primary source of international law, probably the major source of international law today. A treaty can be labeled under different names: compact, convention, agreement, covenant, accord, protocol, etc. What is important is whether the agreement concerned is intended to create international legal rights and obligations. There are 2 or 3 important things to remember in connection with treaties, and the MCC is undoubtedly an agreement of treaty status. So will be the SOFA, so is the AXA. It is only the head of state, head of government, or the foreign minister, or someone duly authorized by one of these entities who could conclude a treaty on behalf of a state. So the finance minister could have concluded the MCC, but he would have had to be authorized by one of these entities, the head of state, head of government, or the foreign minister. So it is not possible for an official or a minister to walk in and say, I wish to sign up to a treaty. It just cannot be done under international law. International law requires, and remember, this is not domestic law. This is not the law that is enforced by our domestic courts and tribunals. This is a law that has to be enforced internationally. International law requires that once entered into, a treaty must be implemented faithfully by the parties. It is not an excuse to argue that domestic legal constraints prevent the implementation of a treaty solemnly concluded. If domestic legal constraints exist, it is for the party concerned not to enter into the treaty or bring the domestic legal framework into line with the provisions of the intended treaty. Usually the practice is for this to be done prior to the conclusion of the treaty. Remember, as Myra said, the MCC needs to be approved by Parliament. That is the purpose behind that provision. Once a treaty has been concluded, it is not possible to plead that even the Constitution is a constraint without incurring adverse international legal consequences. And it's very important to remember that a treaty once concluded binds not only the government that concluded it, it binds the state, which means future governments are bound as well. A party to a treaty cannot simply walk away from that treaty. It remains binding, and it must either be terminated according to its own provisions, customary practice, or modified, in other words, amended. Thus, it would not be possible for Sri Lanka to walk away willy-nilly from the MCC or from any other treaty once it had become party to it. Failure to comply with the provisions of a treaty solemnly concluded could result in the activation of sanctions incorporated in the treaty itself, a dispute resolution provision being triggered. Some treaties do contain dispute resolution mechanisms, including judicial and arbitration provisions. The aggrieved party suspending its obligations, or the party that breached the treaty attracting retaliation. Unilateral retaliation for the breach of a treaty provision can take different forms, such as the imposition of economic and political sanctions, denial of the benefits intended under the treaty, suspension of cooperation, and exclusion from international initiatives. The US, as we know, from reading the newspapers alone, has not been reluctant to impose sanctions on many countries that have incurred its displeasure. So I think the bottom line and the message I would like to leave with you is that before we enter into a treaty, we must do so with taking into account all the consequences of our action. It is very important to take into confidence the elements of our society that may be impacted by such a treaty. The elector, the voter, has to be taken into confidence. Consultations must be conducted on the widest possible level, and Parliament must be kept informed. In the case of these agreements, the AXA, the SOFA, and the MCC, nothing of this was done. In fact, I believe that if not for Iqbal Attas reporting on them in the Sunday Times, many of us would not have been aware of what the country was, or the risks that the country were being placed under. It's very important in the future that no government should be allowed to conclude treaties of any nature without keeping the people, civil society, and Parliament informed. Thank you very much.